Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the battle where Napoleon Bonaparte turned his greatest weakness into history's most devastating trap. December 1805. A French army starving, freezing, outnumbered by 12,000 men, retreating in apparent panic across Moravia. Their emperor just days away from total destruction. Two massive empires closing in for the kill. 85,000 Russian and Austrian soldiers marching to end the French Revolution forever. Every military expert in Europe knew Napoleon was finished. His own marshals questioned whether they'd survive the week. The Allied commanders were already arguing about who deserved credit for the upcoming victory. Then Napoleon did something insane. He abandoned the best defensive position on the battlefield and ran away from it like a coward. The Russians and Austrians couldn't believe their luck. They took the high ground Napoleon had given them and prepared to crush him the next morning. Except Napoleon wasn't retreating, he was hunting. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support, we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about war. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. You're a French corporal, 23 years old. You've never seen peace in your adult life, only revolution, terror, and endless war. You've never questioned that kings and emperors are humanity's natural order, because yours rose from nothing, from artillery officer to master of Europe in just 10 years. You know the revolutionary calendar the way you know your own name, even though the Republic abandoned it months ago. Thermidor, Brumaire, Frimaire, the months of heat, fog, and frost that marked your transformation from citizen to soldier. The smell hits first that morning, not morning frost or campfire smoke. Unwashed bodies pressed together for warmth. 73,000 men who haven't bathed in weeks. Leather and wool soaked with sweat, then frozen stiff overnight. Your coat weighs twice what it should because yesterday's rain turned to ice in the fabric. The musket in your hands is cold enough to burn skin. You made it yourself at the Imperial Armory in Paris. Barrel boring and stock fitting under gaslight, every soldier of the Grand Army taught his weapons construction so he could repair it under fire. The bayonet stays sharper than any kitchen knife you've ever held. A rat crawls over your boot as you stand watch, fat from eating what soldiers left behind during the retreat that wasn't real. November had been a nightmare dressed as victory. The Austrian General Mack surrendered his entire army at Ulm, 30,000 men who laid down their weapons without a real fight. Napoleon's forced marches had surrounded them before they understood what was happening. Europe trembled, then everything collapsed. The Austrians had a second army coming from the east. The Russians were marching west with 80,000 fresh troops. Prussia was mobilizing on the northern border, ready to join whichever side looked stronger. British gold funded the entire coalition, pound sterling buying Austrian muskets and Russian blood to drown the French Revolution once and for all. Napoleon had to retreat. Everyone saw it. Vienna was a trap he couldn't hold. The Grand Army marched backward through Moravia, away from the Austrian capital, seeking defensible ground before winter killed them all. Soldiers grumbled that their emperor had finally overreached. Supply wagons broke down on frozen roads. Men deserted in the night, gambling they'd survive as fugitives better than as corpses. The marshals held council after council, their voices rising in anger at Napoleon's apparently aimless withdrawal. Marshal Lannes wanted to dig in near Brünn. Murat demanded they turn and fight immediately, anywhere, rather than let morale collapse further. Soult studied maps and said nothing, watching Napoleon's finger trace invisible lines across the Moravian countryside. The Pratzen Heights changed everything. A plateau rising 250 feet above the surrounding plain, commanding views for miles in every direction. Ancient roads crossed at its base. Whoever held that ground controlled the battlefield, could see every enemy movement, position artillery to slaughter any attack, anchor defensive lines that would cost thousands to break. Basic military science screamed at Napoleon to fortify the heights and force the Allies to attack uphill into prepared French positions. Napoleon stationed troops there for 2 days. Engineers surveyed artillery positions, infantry dug preliminary earthworks. Then, on November 30th, he ordered complete evacuation. Every soldier, every cannon, every supply wagon pulled back to lower ground west of the plateau. He left the heights empty. Marshal Soult thought his emperor had gone mad. Lannes questioned the order twice before obeying. Junior officers muttered that Bonaparte's genius had finally cracked under the pressure of commanding 73,000 men against 85,000, with more enemy armies approaching from every direction. The troops stumbled backward again, cursing their leaders, wondering if they'd marched 1,000 miles from France just to die in some frozen Moravian field whose name they couldn't pronounce. Russian cavalry scouts reached the Pratzen Heights on December 1st. They found French campfires still smouldering, but no soldiers. The Emperor's tent, clearly Napoleon's because of the maps and writing desk left behind, sat abandoned with papers scattered across the ground as if he'd fled in panic. Cossack riders whooped in triumph and galloped back to report the news. Tsar Alexander the Romanov received the intelligence in his headquarters that evening. 28 years old, ruler of the largest empire on earth, burning to prove himself a military genius like his grandmother Catherine the Great. His generals had watched him grow from spoiled child to absolute monarch without ever experiencing real hardship or defeat. Alexander saw himself as Europe's liberator, the man destined to crush the Corsican upstart and restore legitimate monarchy to France. The news that Napoleon had abandoned the key terrain filled him with electric joy. Austrian Emperor Francis I was more cautious. He'd lost badly to Napoleon in previous wars. His army had just surrendered 30,000 men at Ulm without significant resistance. Francis knew French military capability firsthand. The terrifying speed of their marches, the precision of their artillery, the fanatical courage of men fighting for revolutionary ideals instead of royal pay. But his empire was broken. He needed this victory or Austria would cease to matter in European affairs. The young Russian Tsar's confidence was infectious. Perhaps Napoleon really had overextended himself this time. The Allied War Council met in a commandeered manor house. Russian generals in elaborate uniforms dripping with medals from campaigns against Turks and Persians. Austrian commanders in white coats, their faces carefully neutral as they watched foreign officers argue about strategy on Austrian soil. Everyone had a plan. Most involved complicated maneuvers designed to maximize individual glory rather than military effectiveness. General Franz von Weyrother dominated the discussion. Austrian Chief of Staff, veteran of Turkish wars, absolutely certain he understood how to destroy Napoleon. His plan was straightforward. Use the Pratzen Heights as a staging area, then send a massive force, 40,000 troops, south around Napoleon's right flank, cut the French off from Vienna, sever their supply lines, trap them against the Satchan ponds where they'd have nowhere to retreat. The French army would disintegrate under pressure from superior numbers, just as theory predicted. Russian General Mikhail Kutuzov sat silent through the presentations. 60 years old, missing an eye from a Turkish bullet, veteran of 40 years of warfare across 3 continents. He'd studied Napoleon's campaigns obsessively. Every battle showed the same pattern. Napoleon positioned himself to look vulnerable, Enemies attacked what seemed like weaknesses. Then French reserves appeared from unexpected directions and turned the battle into a slaughter. Kutuzov had fought Turks who used similar deception tactics. He recommended caution. Alexander overruled him. The Tsar wanted glory, wanted it now, wanted to be the man who defeated Napoleon Bonaparte in decisive battle before his 29th birthday. Weyrother's plan was adopted with minor modifications. The Allies would attack December 2nd at dawn. Napoleon spent the evening of December 1st in a farmhouse 3 miles from the Pratzen Heights. His marshals gathered around a table covered with maps marked in his distinctive handwriting. Each position labelled with unit strengths, artillery counts, march times calculated to the minute. He'd been building this trap since leaving Vienna. The deliberately abandoned equipment at his Pratzen Heights headquarters had been carefully chosen. Old maps with false troop positions, letters discussing fictional supply problems, everything calculated to reinforce Allied assumptions that the French were desperate and disorganised. The retreat itself had been theatre, hurried enough to look like panic, slow enough that Allied scouts could track every movement. Marshal Soult finally understood. Napoleon had been feeding the Allies intelligence designed to make them attack in a specific way. The abandoned heights weren't a mistake. They were bait. The weakened right flank under Marshal Davout wasn't a vulnerability, it was an anvil. When the Allies committed their reserves to attacking that flank, the Pratzen Heights in their rear would be nearly empty. Then Soult's corps would strike. The math was brutal and beautiful. If the Allies took the bait, and every piece of intelligence said they would, they'd send 40,000 men marching away from the heights to attack Davout's 12,000. That meant only 20,000 Allied troops holding the plateau against Soult's 25,000 waiting in concealed positions. Napoleon would recapture the heights in the centre of the Allied line, cutting their army in half. The southern force attacking Davout would be trapped between his anvil and the hammer of French reserves. The northern force would be isolated and destroyed piecemeal. But it required perfect timing. Davout had to hold long enough for Soult to take the heights, but couldn't collapse too quickly, or the southern Allied force would retreat to safety. Soult had to strike at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the heights wouldn't be empty enough. Too late, and Davout's corps would be annihilated. The French left under Lannes had to pin the Allied right in place so they couldn't reinforce either the centre or the south. 3 separate battles had to unfold simultaneously, with minute-by-minute coordination across miles of freezing terrain in December fog. One miscalculation meant destruction. The Allies had 12,000 more troops. They held the high ground. Their combined forces included the elite Russian Imperial Guard, the most prestigious unit in Europe, never defeated in battle. If Napoleon's timing failed by even 30 minutes, the Grand Army would be caught in the open and destroyed. Marshal Lannes asked the obvious question: what if Davout couldn't hold? What if 12,000 men couldn't survive against 40,000 for the 4 hours Napoleon's plan required? Napoleon looked up from the maps. Davout would hold because Davout understood what failure meant. Not just death, but the end of revolutionary France, the restoration of Bourbon monarchy, the guillotining of everyone who'd fought for liberté, égalité, fraternité. Ideological conviction would keep those 12,000 men fighting when flesh and blood wanted to run. They weren't mercenaries paid in coin. They were citizens who'd toppled a king and would die before kneeling to another. The orders went out at midnight. Couriers galloped through frozen darkness carrying sealed instructions to each marshal. Davout was to position his corps on the southern flank and prepare for defensive battle against overwhelming odds. Soult was to concentrate 25,000 troops in dead ground west of the Pratzen Heights, hidden from Allied observation posts, ready to attack on signal. Lannes would demonstrate against the Allied right, making enough noise to convince them he was the main French attack. Murat's cavalry would screen the French centre, preventing Allied scouts from discovering how thin Napoleon's line actually was. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite reserve, would remain uncommitted until the critical moment. They were his insurance policy, the force he'd throw into whatever crisis developed. Veterans of a dozen campaigns, they'd held firm when conscript units broke. Napoleon trusted them absolutely, but wouldn't waste them on anything except the decisive point. Allied campfires blazed across the Pratzen Heights that night. Russian soldiers drank vodka and sang songs about previous victories. Austrian troops cleaned weapons and wrote letters they hoped families would receive if things went badly. Officers reviewed Weyrother's plan one final time, memorizing the complicated sequence of movements their units would execute at dawn. Everyone agreed the battle would be over by noon. The French were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and caught in an impossible position. Tomorrow belonged to the Allies. Napoleon couldn't sleep. He walked among his soldiers despite the freezing temperature, moving from campfire to campfire without guards or ceremony. Veterans recognized him immediately. The small frame, the grey coat, the hands clasped behind his back. He asked about their homes, their families, whether they had enough ammunition for tomorrow. Most hadn't eaten anything but hard bread in 2 days, but they told their emperor they were ready to fight. One corporal complained the Allies had stolen the best ground and would slaughter them from the heights. Napoleon smiled and said the heights would be French by 10 in the morning. The soldier laughed, thinking it was a joke. His emperor's expression didn't change. The laughter died. The corporal realized Bonaparte was serious, that somehow this retreat and apparent disaster had been intentional, that everything was proceeding according to a plan only Napoleon fully understood. Word spread through the ranks. Morale transformed in hours. The Grand Army wasn't retreating to survive. They were bait in history's largest trap. Tomorrow they'd prove again that France couldn't be defeated by old empires fighting old wars with old tactics. Revolutionary fire burned away the cold. December 2nd, 1805, the anniversary of Napoleon's coronation as Emperor of France. He'd chosen this date deliberately, wanted his greatest victory to coincide with the day he'd transformed from first consul to hereditary monarch. The symbolism mattered to a man who understood that power grew from myth as much as military success. The trap was set. The Allies had taken every piece of bait Napoleon offered. Their army stood poised to execute a plan their enemy had written for them. Dawn was 3 hours away. 3 a.m. on December 2nd felt like dying slowly. Cold penetrated wool, leather, skin, muscle, bone, working inward until men shivered uncontrollably despite being pressed together for warmth. The Grand Army slept in formation across frozen fields. No tents, no shelters, just bodies arranged in squares that would become battle lines at dawn. A single blanket shared between 3 soldiers meant the man in the middle survived, while those on the edges risked frostbite. Rotation happened every hour, a silent agreement that kept units combat ready. Private Jean-Baptiste Clément had marched 847 miles from Boulogne. His boots, issued in August, had disintegrated to the point where he tied them together with wire scavenged from a battlefield fence. The soles were leather cut from a dead Austrian's pack at Ulm. His uniform coat had been blue once but now showed brown and black stains from mud, blood, powder burns. 22 years old. Never kissed a girl. Never owned land. Never questioned that the revolution had transformed him from peasant to citizen, from property to participant in history. Hunger was the constant companion. The supply wagons couldn't keep pace with Napoleon's forced marches. 30 miles some days, the army moving so fast that Austrian resistance collapsed before materializing. Rations had been half portions for 3 weeks, quarter portions the last 5 days. Men boiled bark for soup and called it stew. They chewed leather straps to trick their stomachs into feeling full. Clement's last real meal had been November 28th, a potato shared with two others, eaten raw because fires would reveal their position. Sergeant Moreau told stories to keep the conscripts calm. 41 years old, veteran of campaigns back to the Revolutionary Wars when France stood alone against all Europe. He'd bayoneted royalists at Valmy, watched the guillotine work in Paris, survived Egypt's heat and Syria's sieges. His left hand was missing 3 fingers from a Russian musket ball at Zurich. The stumps had healed badly, purple and twisted, but he could still load and fire faster than men with all their digits. Moreau explained what would happen when battle started. The officers would blow whistles and drums would beat the advance. The line would move forward at 70 steps per minute, muskets at shoulder arms, bayonets fixed. Enemy artillery would open fire at 600 yards, solid shot that looked like black dots growing larger until they smashed through ranks and turned men into red mist. At 300 yards the canister would start, tin cans filled with musket balls that spread like shotgun blasts and killed in clusters. At 100 yards both sides would fire their first volley. Then it became murder. Loading a musket under fire required 12 separate actions executed in exact sequence. Bite the paper cartridge, pour powder down the barrel, ram the ball home, prime the pan, cock the hammer, aim at the mass of enemy soldiers, fire into the smoke that made seeing impossible after the 3rd volley. Repeat until someone's bayonet found your intestines or a ball shattered your skull. Good troops managed 3 shots per minute. Veterans could do 4. Speed mattered because whoever fired more rounds killed more enemies before the lines collided. The bayonet charge was what separated soldiers from corpses. 17 inches of triangular steel designed to puncture organs without getting stuck in bone. French infantry trained for it obsessively. The scream that preceded impact, the shoulder slam that knocked enemies off balance, the upward thrust under the ribs that reached the heart. Moreau described the sound of steel entering flesh, wet and soft like stabbing a watermelon, nothing heroic about it. Men's bowels released when they died. The smell was worse than the sight. Conscripts asked how you lived through a bayonet charge. Moreau said you didn't think, just moved, stayed in formation because isolated soldiers died in seconds. The line was everything. As long as the line held, individual men could be replaced. Break formation and panic spread like fire through dry grass. Officers would shoot their own troops to stop a rout because 20 executed deserters saved the regiment. Austrian soldiers camped on the Pratzen Heights didn't share their fears because most didn't expect to fight. General Weyrother's plan called for the southern force to do the real work. 40,000 troops crushing Napoleon's weak right flank, while the centre and north held defensive positions. The Austrians manning the heights anticipated a quiet morning, watching Russians earn the glory. Their campfires burned bright and wasteful, officers allowing it because they controlled the high ground, and visibility didn't matter when you weren't the attacker. Russian troops preparing for the southern assault operated under different assumptions. Their officers distributed extra vodka rations at midnight, understanding that courage often came from bottles. The Imperial Guard drank less because they had reputation instead of fear. Formed under Catherine the Great, they'd fought Turks, Poles, Swedes, never retreating, never breaking. Their standards carried battle honours from 20 campaigns. They wore green uniforms instead of the regular army's brown, taller bearskin hats, gold braid marking them as elite. Guardsmen looked down on regular Russian infantry the way regular infantry looked down on Austrian auxiliaries. Prince Pyotr Bagration commanded Russia's advance guard, 9,000 troops who'd march first and hit hardest. 40 years old, Georgian aristocrat, veteran of Suvorov's Italian campaigns, where Russian armies had shattered French republicans in brutal mountain fighting. Bagration despised Napoleon personally, seeing him as a jumped-up commoner pretending to royalty. The fact that this Corsican artillery officer now called himself emperor turned Bagration's contempt into rage. Tomorrow would settle accounts between legitimate nobility and revolutionary pretenders. The Russian artillery chief, General Uvarov, spent the pre-dawn hours positioning his guns. Russian cannons were magnificent, 12-pounders cast in Tula, accurate to 800 yards, capable of firing 3 rounds per minute with experienced crews. Uvarov had 3 Oystein guns total, the largest concentration of artillery in any European battle to date. His plan was methodical. First soften French positions with solid shot, then switch to canister when they advanced, then grape shot when they got close. Mathematics of murder. Each gun could kill or wound 15 men per minute at optimal range. Simple multiplication suggested the French would lose 4,170 casualties per minute once Uvarov's batteries opened fire. Except Napoleon had positioned his own artillery in ways that made Russian calculations meaningless. French guns hid in dead ground, behind ridges, inside tree lines, invisible to Allied observation posts on the heights. General Eblé commanded the French Artillery Corps, and he'd learned siege warfare during the Revolution, when Republican armies had to take royalist fortresses with outdated equipment and brilliant improvisation. Eblé understood that artillery duels favoured whoever surprised the enemy first. His batteries would stay silent until Russian columns marched into preset kill zones, then open fire simultaneously from multiple directions. Crossfire multiplied effectiveness beyond what raw gun count suggested. Marshal Davout's corps occupied the French right flank, the anvil that had to hold while the rest of Napoleon's plan unfolded. His 3 divisions totaled 12,000 troops spread across 3 miles of frozen fields. The math was horrific. 40,000 Allied soldiers would attack his position starting at dawn, more than 3-to-1 odds. Davout compensated with terrain. He'd positioned his units behind a stream called the Goldbach, not much of an obstacle, but enough to slow attacking columns and disrupt their formations. Every bridge was covered by artillery. Every ford had infantry dug in behind improvised earthworks. Davout's soldiers knew they were sacrificial. Officers didn't lie about the odds or pretend tomorrow would be easy. Third Corps would take devastating casualties holding the line. Many wouldn't survive to sunset, but their job was buying time. 4 hours, maybe 5, until Soult took the Pratzen Heights and relieved pressure. 4 hours of fighting 3-to-1 while preventing breakthrough. 4 hours of dying in the mud so the rest of the Grand Army could win. Some men wrote letters to families they'd never see again. Others sharpened bayonets that were already razor-edged, needing activity to manage fear. A few prayed to gods they'd stopped believing in years ago, hoping divine intervention might improve impossible odds. Most just sat in silence, staring at stars that seemed impossibly bright and cold, and indifferent to whatever happened when the sun rose. Corporal Suchet had survived 7 battles since enlisting in 1803. He'd watched friends die at Marengo, seen men drown at the Danube crossings, bayoneted an Austrian so young the boy probably lied about his age to join the army. War had taught Suchet that courage was a lie soldiers told each other. Nobody was brave, some were just better at hiding terror. Tomorrow he'd stand in line and load and fire until a ball found him or the enemy broke. The alternative was desertion, and deserters got shot by their own officers. Better to die facing forward. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about war. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The waiting was worse than fighting. Combat reduced everything to immediate action, Load, fire, advance, reload. Waiting meant thinking about the cannonball that might remove your legs, or the infection that killed slowly after minor wounds. Field hospitals were butcher shops staffed by surgeons who'd learned their trade amputating limbs without anaesthesia. Wounded men screamed for hours before shock or blood loss silenced them. Many soldiers carried extra cartridges specifically to shoot themselves if they took stomach wounds, because gut-shot men died over days in agony that made death preferable. 4 a.m. Russian columns began forming in the darkness. Officers shouted orders in accents from Moscow, St. Petersburg, the Georgian highlands, Siberian outposts. The army of Tsar Alexander represented the empire's diversity. Orthodox Russians alongside Muslim Tatars, Lutheran Baltic Germans next to Buddhist Kalmyks. What unified them was absolute obedience to the Tsar and faith that superior numbers would crush French resistance. Russian military doctrine emphasized mass over finesse, accepting heavy casualties as inevitable cost of victory. Allied war councils had calculated acceptable losses at 30%. If 85,000 troops took 25,000 casualties but destroyed Napoleon's 73,000-man army, the exchange favoured the coalition. Britain would pay to rebuild Austrian forces. Russia had millions of serfs to conscript as replacements. France was running out of men after 15 years of continuous warfare. This was mathematics, not sentiment. Trade lives for strategic advantage and let God sort the bodies. Napoleon watched enemy campfires from his command post and knew exactly what those lights represented. Each fire marked company positions. Russian doctrine called for 60 men per fire for warmth and cooking. By counting fires and estimating spacing, he calculated troop concentrations to within 5% accuracy. The southern mass was forming exactly as predicted. The centre on the heights showed fewer fires, meaning units were moving south to join the main attack. The northern positions remained static, defending but not advancing. Everything was proceeding according to Napoleon's design. The Allies were executing the plan he'd written for them through careful deception and abandoned intelligence. But knowing the enemy's intentions didn't make the coming battle less dangerous. Davout still had to hold against 3-1 odds. Soult still had to execute a perfectly timed assault up steep terrain against entrenched positions. Lannes still had to pin superior numbers in place without getting his corps destroyed. One failure broke the entire sequence. Marshal Soult's corps waited in dead ground west of the Pratzen Heights. They'd moved into position during the night, 25,000 men creeping forward in darkness, maintaining silence that was almost supernatural for an army that size. Officers had ordered bayonets sharpened to avoid metallic sounds from grinding stones. Troops wrapped canteens to prevent sloshing. Even the horses were muzzled to stop nervous whinnying. The entire corps lay hidden 800 yards from Allied positions, waiting for Napoleon's signal. Soult's division commanders, Vandamme, Saint-Hilaire, Legrand, had received their orders at 2 a.m. The attack would begin when cannon fire sounded from the French right, indicating the Allied assault on Davout had started. Soult would wait exactly 90 minutes after first shots, allowing the heights to empty as Allied reserves moved south. Then the signal gun would fire from Napoleon's position, one shot, unmistakable. All 3 divisions would advance simultaneously in column formation, hit the heights from 3 directions, overwhelm the thinned-out defences before the Allies realised what was happening. Timing was everything. Attack too early and 20,000 Allied troops would still hold the heights in strength. Attack too late and Davout's corps would collapse. The southern Allied force would wheel north, and Soult would face enemies from 2 directions. The window for success was perhaps 30 minutes, from the moment the heights became vulnerable until the Allies recognised the danger and responded. 5 a.m. Russian artillery began moving south off the Pratzen Heights. Uvarov's magnificent 12-pounders rolled down frozen roads, crews cursing the cold and the weight and the darkness that made movement dangerous. Guns that took wrong turns or broke wheels on ice-rutted paths would miss the initial bombardment. Russian officers pushed their crews mercilessly because the battle plan required artillery to suppress French positions before infantry attacked. Without cannon support, the assault columns would face direct fire from Davout's guns and take horrific casualties before reaching bayonet range. The sound of Russian guns moving south carried across the frozen landscape. French sentries heard wheels creaking, officers shouting, the distinctive metallic jingle of artillery harnesses. Reports went to battalion commanders, then regimental, then divisional. Marshal Davout received confirmation at 5:20 a.m. The Allied artillery was repositioning for southern assault. The trap's final element was falling into place. Austrian troops remaining on the Pratzen Heights numbered perhaps 8,000 by 6 a.m. Most were second-line units, older men, recent conscripts, garrison troops pulled from comfortable posts and thrust into field service. They watched their Russian allies march south with mixed feelings. Relief that someone else would do the dangerous work. Resentment that foreigners would earn glory on Austrian soil. Unease that the heights, so heavily defended yesterday, now felt almost empty. Some Austrian officers questioned the wisdom of stripping the centre to reinforce the flanks. Military theory said you never abandoned high ground unless forced, but General Weyrother's plan had been approved by both emperors, and junior officers didn't contradict decisions made by men who commanded empires. They watched Russian columns disappear into pre-dawn darkness and hoped the plan was as brilliant as Weyrother claimed. 6:30 a.m. The sky began changing from black to grey. Visibility extended to perhaps 200 yards in the gathering light. Then fog rolled across the battlefield like a physical entity, thick, white, impenetrable. Allied soldiers on the heights couldn't see the base of their own plateau. Russian columns marching south couldn't see the roads ahead. Davout's corps defending the French right became invisible to the attackers, preparing to assault their positions. Napoleon saw the fog and smiled. Weather had given him one final gift. The Allies would attack blind, unable to coordinate their assault, their numerical advantage reduced because they couldn't see where to mass their forces. Soult's approach to the heights would be completely hidden until the last moment. The fog was perfect, thick enough to conceal movement but not so dense that it prevented combat once battle started. The waiting was ending. Russian advance guards began their approach to the Goldbach stream at 7 a.m. Austrian observers on the heights reported seeing nothing through the fog but hearing unmistakable sounds of large-scale troop movement. Napoleon's headquarters received reports every 15 minutes. Enemy columns advancing south, artillery moving into position, cavalry screening the Russian left flank. Everything predicted, everything prepared for. Marshal Davout's troops fixed bayonets at 7:15 a.m. The sound of 12,000 men snapping steel onto musket barrels created a metallic wave that travelled through the fog. Soldiers checked their cartridge boxes, 40 rounds per man, enough for maybe 15 minutes of sustained fire at battlefield consumption rates. After that, they'd rely on bayonets and whatever ammunition they could scavenge from the dead. The sun was rising somewhere beyond the fog. Nobody could see it, but the grey darkness lightened incrementally, minute by minute. Russian columns were close now. Davout's sentries reported hearing voices, equipment rattling, the unmistakable sound of thousands of boots on frozen ground. The advance guard would hit French positions any minute. Then the real killing would start, and on the Pratzen Heights, Austrian defenders waited in fog so thick they couldn't see their own artillery pieces. Somewhere below them, 40,000 Russian soldiers were marching to destroy Napoleon's right flank. Somewhere in the fog, the French emperor waited with his trap armed and ready. The greatest battle of the Napoleonic Wars was about to begin, and the men who die in the next 8 hours didn't know they were executing a plan their enemy had designed specifically to kill them. The first Russian artillery piece fired at 7:42 a.m., a 12-pounder positioned 600 yards from Davout's lines, invisible in fog so dense the gun crew aimed by compass bearing rather than visual targets. The solid shot screamed through white void and impacted frozen ground 40 yards short of French positions, throwing up a geyser of dirt and ice. The sound rolled across the battlefield like thunder, flat, percussive, unmistakable. Battle had begun. Davout's artillery responded within 30 seconds. His gun crews had spent the night pre-sighting their weapons on probable Russian approach routes, marking angles and elevations with notched sticks. They fired blind into the fog at predetermined coordinates, trusting mathematics over vision. French cannonballs tore through Russian columns still forming for assault. Men died without seeing what killed them. Officers screamed orders that disappeared into white emptiness and artillery roar. The bombardment escalated rapidly. Russian batteries deployed along a 2-mile front, each gun firing as soon as crews finished positioning and loading. Within 5 minutes, 120 cannons were hurling iron into the fog at 3 rounds per minute. The noise became physical force, pressure waves that compressed lungs and made ears bleed. Solid shot punched through multiple ranks when it hit massed infantry. Bodies exploded in patterns that followed simple physics, tissue and bone separating along vectors of least resistance. French counter-battery fire intensified. General Eblay's hidden guns opened from positions the Russians didn't know existed. Behind ridges, inside tree lines, arranged for crossfire that turned Russian artillery positions into killing grounds. A 12-pound ball travelling at 1,000 feet per second could dismember a horse, shatter a gun carriage, decapitate 3 men standing in line. Eblay's crews aimed for the muzzle flashes barely visible through fog, firing at where enemy guns revealed themselves through their own shots. Russian General Dokhturov commanded the Southern Assault Force, 40 regiments organised into columns designed to smash through Davout's thin line through sheer mass. His orders were specific: cross the Goldbach stream, overwhelm French resistance, cut the road to Vienna. The fog was an unexpected complication, but Dokhturov had fought in worse conditions during Turkish campaigns. He ordered the advance at 8 a.m. sharp, columns moving forward by regiment at 70 paces per minute. The first Russian column hit the Goldbach at Telnitz village. 3,000 troops crammed into formation 200 men wide and 15 ranks deep, a battering ram of flesh and steel designed to break anything in its path. French defenders numbered perhaps 400, a single battalion holding stone buildings along the stream. The Russians fired a volley into the fog, advanced 20 paces, fired again. Return fire came from windows and doorways, musket balls at 50 yards that couldn't miss hitting someone in that density of targets. Colonel Schobert commanded the French defenders at Telnitz, 36 years old, promoted from sergeant during revolutionary wars when aristocratic officers fled and competence mattered more than birth. He'd fortified the village overnight, barricaded streets, loopholed walls, positioned sharpshooters in church towers. His 400 men had clear orders: hold until relieved or annihilated. No retreat. Schobert watched Russian shadows materialize from fog and knew relief wasn't coming for hours. The Russians assaulted Telnitz with tactics that predated gunpowder. Column rushed forward, accepted casualties, crashed against defensive positions through overwhelming numbers. French musket fire dropped 30 men in the first rank, 50 in the second. The third rank climbed over corpses and kept advancing. Bayonets found French defenders in doorways. Hand-to-hand fighting turned the village into a charnel house, men stabbing, clubbing, strangling with hands when weapons broke. Schaubert's battalion held for 27 minutes against 50-1 odds. Every building became a separate fortress requiring individual assault. Russians finally overwhelmed the church by setting it on fire and shooting defenders as they fled the flames. Schaubert died leading a bayonet counterattack that briefly recaptured the village square before Russian reserves crushed his survivors. Of 400 French soldiers at Telnitz, 17 escaped. The village cost Russia 800 casualties taking it. 2 miles north at Sokolnitz village, a similar slaughter unfolded. French defenders held stone bridges across the Goldbach, while Russian columns attacked in waves. The stream was barely 4 feet deep, but its banks were steep and muddy, slowing attackers to walking speed while French muskets fired from fortified positions. Bodies piled in the water until they formed a dam that diverted the stream's flow. Russians used their own dead as stepping stones to reach the French bank. Marshal Davout watched from horseback 500 yards behind his collapsing line. He had expected to lose Telnitz and Sokolnitz. The villages were indefensible against such overwhelming force. What mattered was buying time and exacting maximum casualties. By 8:30 a.m. the Russians had taken both villages but lost perhaps 2,000 men doing it. Davout's corps had lost 600 defenders but delayed the Allied advance by 90 minutes. The mathematics of sacrifice were working as Napoleon predicted. Russian artillery rolled forward once the villages fell, occupying positions closer to French lines. Uvarov's gunners deployed 80 cannons in a grand battery designed to pulverize Davout's next defensive position, a ridge line 800 yards west of the stream. The fog was lifting slightly, visibility extending to 300 yards in places, enough for gun crews to see their targets. Russian 12-pounders opened fire in coordinated salvos that landed like metal hail along the French ridge. Davout's infantry absorbed the bombardment in formation. Officers forbade troops from taking cover because scattered soldiers couldn't execute coordinated movements. Men stood in ranks while cannonballs tore through their lines, closing gaps automatically as comrades died, maintaining the geometric precision that made Napoleonic armies effective. Every soldier knew the calculus. Individual survival mattered less than collective discipline. Break formation, and everyone died. Hold formation, and the unit survived even if 60% became casualties. The Russian advance resumed at 9 a.m. Infantry columns emerged from the captured villages in massive formations. 12 battalions arranged in 3 grand columns, 15,000 troops moving forward like slow avalanches. French artillery opened fire at 600 yards with solid shot that carved corridors through the formations. At 300 yards, the French switched to canister, tin cans filled with musket balls that spread like shotgun blasts. Each canister killed or wounded 20 men when fired into densely packed columns. Davout's infantry held fire until the Russians reached 100 yards. Then the French line erupted in a volley that stopped the advance cold. 12,000 muskets firing simultaneously created a wall of lead that dropped the entire front rank of all 3 Russian columns. The second rank stepped over the dead and continued forward. French soldiers reloaded with mechanical precision. Bite cartridge, pour powder, ram ball, prime pan, cock hammer, aim, fire. 12 distinct actions completed in 20 seconds by veterans who'd done it 1,000 times. The Russian columns kept coming. Their doctrine emphasized bayonet assault over firepower, accepting losses during the approach because overwhelming numbers would prevail in close combat. French troops could fire 3 rounds per minute, but Russians could cover 100 yards in 90 seconds. The math said casualties were temporary, while captured ground was permanent. Russian officers drove their men forward with the absolute certainty that mass would triumph. 50 yards separated the armies when the Russians fired their first volley, a ragged discharge compared to French precision, but 15,000 muskets at point-blank range didn't need accuracy. French soldiers dropped by hundreds. Davout's line contracted but didn't break. The Russians charged the final distance with levelled bayonets, screaming in languages from across the empire, closing on French positions that had thinned but not collapsed. The bayonet fight lasted 11 minutes, triangular steel puncturing flesh, musket butts crushing skulls, men too close to reload so they stabbed and clubbed and bit. French infantry held their ground through pure determination. They'd been told to hold for 4 hours and 3 had passed. Relief was coming. Death now meant dying for nothing. Russians had numerical superiority and momentum, but French troops fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant execution by their own officers. Davout committed his reserve at 9:15 a.m. A brigade of 2,000 troops held back for exactly this crisis. They hit the Russian right flank in column formation, bayonets fixed, drums beating the attack. The Russian advance staggered under the impact. Their officers tried to redeploy units to face the new threat, but formations were too tangled from close combat. The French reserve carved into the Russian mass like an axe into soft wood. The Russian assault broke at 9:23 a.m. Not routed, they withdrew in relatively good order, collecting wounded, maintaining formations. But they retreated 400 yards back toward the stream, leaving perhaps 1,500 dead on the slope they'd tried to capture. Davout's corps had lost 800 men in the engagement. The French still held the ridge. The Southern Allied assault had failed to break through. General Dokhturov regrouped his forces and prepared for a second assault. He still had over 30,000 effective troops against Davout's remaining 8,000. The math remained favourable. Russian artillery would bombard the ridge for 30 minutes, then fresh columns would attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Weight of numbers would eventually overwhelm French resistance. It was inevitable. But while Dokhturov reorganized his southern force, the entire strategic situation was transforming 3 miles north on the Pratzen Heights. The trap Napoleon had spent weeks preparing was about to close. Marshal Soult watched the sun burn through the fog at 8:45 a.m. Visibility improved minute by minute, first to 200 yards, then 400, then suddenly the entire southern slope of the Pratzen Heights stood revealed. Austrian defenders were visible on the plateau, their positions obvious, their numbers clearly insufficient. Russian reserves that should have been holding the centre had marched south to reinforce Dokhturov's assault. The heights were defended by perhaps 8,000 troops spread across 2 miles. Soult's 25,000 men had been waiting in dead ground for 90 minutes, listening to the battle rage south of their position, invisible to Allied observers. Now the fog was clearing and the strategic moment had arrived. Soult sent a courier galloping to Napoleon's headquarters with a single word: ready. Napoleon received the message at 8:52 a.m. He'd been sitting on his horse for 3 hours, watching the fog, listening to artillery fire from the south, calculating whether Davout's corps was still intact or had collapsed under overwhelming pressure. The courier's message confirmed what the sound suggested. Davout was holding, the southern assault was stalled, the heights were vulnerable. Napoleon ordered the signal gun fired. A single cannon shot rang out at 9 a.m. from Napoleon's command position. The report echoed across the battlefield, audible even over the continuing artillery duel to the south. Every French unit heard it. Every marshal knew what it meant. Soult's corps began advancing on the Pratzen Heights from 3 directions simultaneously. St. Hilaire's division attacked from the southwest, 8,000 troops in column formation moving uphill at quick march. The Austrian defenders saw them coming but couldn't believe the scale of the assault. Where had 8,000 Frenchmen come from? Intelligence reports said Napoleon's forces were concentrated on the southern flank fighting Dokhturov. The appearance of a full division attacking the heights made no tactical sense unless the entire French deployment had been deception. Austrian artillery opened fire at 800 yards. Their guns were positioned for defensive fire against frontal assault, perfect angles, clear fields of fire, pre-ranged distances. The problem was numbers. 20 Austrian cannons against a division-strength assault wasn't enough. St. Hilaire's columns absorbed the fire and continued advancing. Men died, but the formations didn't slow. At 400 yards, French skirmishers deployed and began picking off Austrian gun crews with rifle fire. At 200 yards, St. Hilaire ordered the charge. 8,000 French soldiers surged up the final slope at a dead run. They hit Austrian defensive positions like a tidal wave hitting a sandcastle. Brief resistance at the crest, bayonet fighting that lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Then the Austrian line disintegrated. Survivors retreated east across the plateau, abandoning guns, equipment, positions they'd held since December the 1st. St. Hilaire's division captured the southern heights by 9:24 a.m. Vandame's division assaulted the central heights simultaneously. His 9,000 troops faced stiffer resistance. Russian units that hadn't marched south yet, better positions, artillery support. The fighting here turned savage. Russians refused to yield ground their Tsar had personally ordered them to hold. French troops attacked in waves, each repulsed with heavy losses, reforming and attacking again. Artillery fire from both sides turned the plateau into a killing ground, where survival was random chance. A Russian counterattack at 9:30 a.m. nearly threw Vandame back down the slope. 3 regiments of the Russian IV Corps charged downhill with fixed bayonets, their green uniforms appearing through powder smoke like ghosts. French troops recoiled from the impact. Vandame personally rallied a battalion on the verge of breaking, riding among them while musket balls whined past his head. The counterattack stalled 100 yards from the crest. Russian officers ordered a second charge, but their men had taken too many casualties. The assault died in confused fighting where neither side gained advantage. Legrand's division hit the northern heights with 8,000 troops against minimal resistance. The Russians had stripped this sector completely, sending every available unit south to Dokhturov's assault. Legrand encountered perhaps 2,000 Austrian rearguard troops who fired a single volley and retreated. His division occupied the northern plateau by 9:35 a.m. without significant casualties. By 9:40 a.m., Soult controlled 2/3 of the Pratzen Heights. Only the central sector remained contested, where Vandame's division traded volleys with Russian forces that refused to break. Napoleon had recaptured the key terrain in 40 minutes. The Allied army was now cut in half, 40,000 troops south of the heights attacking Davout, 25,000 troops north of the heights facing Lannes, and both forces separated by French-controlled high ground. Tsar Alexander received reports of the disaster at 9:45 a.m. His headquarters staff couldn't explain how the French had taken the heights without anyone noticing their approach. The fog had concealed Soult's advance, but the larger failure was intelligence. Russian scouts had reported all major French forces committed elsewhere. The attack from dead ground suggested planning and deception that went back days or weeks. Alexander finally understood he'd been outmaneuvered. General Kutuzov, watching from the northern sector, recognized the tactical situation immediately. The Allied army had walked into a trap. Their entire southern force was now operating behind enemy-held high ground. Supplied by roads the French could interdict from the heights. Retreat would be a nightmare. Units withdrawing under fire from elevated positions. Kutuzov recommended immediate withdrawal before the situation became catastrophic. Alexander refused. The Tsar was 28 years old and had staked his reputation on this battle. Admitting defeat now meant accepting that Napoleon had outthought him, that Russian military prowess was inferior to French genius. Pride overruled tactical sense. Alexander ordered the Russian Imperial Guard to retake the Pratzen Heights. If his elite troops couldn't break the French, nothing could. The Russian Imperial Guard had never been defeated in battle. 4 regiments of the finest soldiers in the Russian Empire, the Preobrazhensky, Semyonovsky, Izmailovsky, and Chevalier Guards. They wore immaculate green uniforms with gold facings, tall bearskin hats that made them look like giants, carried muskets individually fitted to each soldier. Their standards bore battle honours from Catherine the Great's Turkish wars. They drilled until every movement was instinctive, every man capable of loading and firing 5 rounds per minute. The Guard formed for assault at 10 a.m. 5,000 troops in parade ground formation, even though they were advancing into combat. Their officers rode thoroughbred horses, their colours flew from gilded staffs, their drums beat perfect rhythm. They marched uphill toward Vandam's bloodied division, with the confidence of men who'd never experienced defeat. Napoleon watched the Russian Guard advance and committed his own reserve. The French Imperial Guard, veterans who'd been with him since Italy, who'd saved the Republic at Marengo, who'd marched to Egypt and back. They wore blue coats with red facings, bearskin hats that matched their Russian counterparts, carried weapons maintained to standards that exceeded even Russian perfectionism. Napoleon had held them in reserve for exactly this moment, the crisis point where elite troops would decide the battle. The 2 Imperial Guards met on the central Pratzen Heights at 10:15 a.m., the finest soldiers of 2 empires, clash of military excellence that happened perhaps once in a generation. Both sides fired at 60 yards, simultaneous volleys that dropped 200 men in seconds, both reloaded and fired again at 40 yards. The smoke was so dense that soldiers aimed at muzzle flashes rather than visible targets. At 20 yards they charged with bayonets. No tactical finesse, just 2 bodies of elite troops smashing together in the most brutal form of warfare. Guardsmen stabbed, clubbed, shot at point-blank range, fought with knives when muskets broke. The melee consumed both formations. No front lines, no rear areas, just individual combat scattered across 200 yards of blood-soaked plateau. The Russian Guard broke first, not routed, not panicked, but exhausted and unable to continue. They had lost 200 men in 11 minutes against an enemy that matched their skill and exceeded their determination. The survivors withdrew in formation, standards still flying, maintaining discipline even in retreat. But they'd been defeated. The myth of invincibility was broken. The Pratzen Heights belonged to Napoleon at 10:30 a.m. His forces controlled the commanding terrain while Allied armies floundered in the lowlands on either side. The trap had closed. Now came the slaughter. Napoleon rode to the summit of the Pratzen Heights at 10:35 a.m. From this elevation he could see the entire battlefield, Davout's battered corps still holding the southern line, Lannes engaging Allied forces to the north, and most critically, the 40,000-man Russian southern force now trapped behind French-controlled high ground. The strategic situation had transformed completely in 90 minutes. What began as Allied offensive had become French encirclement. General Eblé immediately repositioned his artillery on the heights. 70 French cannons rolled to the plateau's southern edge, where they commanded perfect angles on Russian forces below. The guns could fire directly into Dokhturov's formations from 800 yards with clear line of sight. Russian troops that had been assaulting Davout now found themselves under bombardment from their rear. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers fighting enemies in front while cannonballs screamed from positions that should have been held by Allied forces. Dokhturov's southern assault collapsed at 10:45 a.m. His troops had fought for 3 hours trying to break Davout's line, losing perhaps 5,000 casualties in the attempt. Now, French artillery from the heights was killing them from behind while Davout's reinforced corps pressed from the front. Russian officers tried to reorganize their formations, but artillery fire made coherent movement impossible. Columns broke apart seeking cover that didn't exist on open terrain. What had been an army became clusters of frightened men looking for somewhere safe. Prince Bagration commanded the Russian forces still capable of offensive action. His advance guard hadn't participated in the southern assault, remaining fresh while Dokhturov's troops exhausted themselves. Bagration recognized the tactical disaster unfolding, but saw one possibility for salvation: attack the French on the heights from the south, retake the plateau, restore the Allied position. His 9,000 troops were elite units, guards regiments, grenadier companies, veteran soldiers who'd conquered half of Europe under Suvorov. If anyone could reverse the situation, Bagration could. The Russian counterattack began at 11 a.m. Bagration's troops advanced uphill in perfect formation despite artillery fire that tore through their ranks. These were professionals executing parade ground movements under combat conditions that would have broken conscript units in minutes. They absorbed casualties without breaking stride, closed gaps automatically, maintained the geometric precision that made Napoleonic warfare possible. At 400 yards, they began taking fire from French infantry on the heights. At 200 yards, the casualties became catastrophic. Saint-Hilaire's division held the southern heights, with 6,000 remaining effectives after the morning's fighting. They'd fortified their positions during the brief lull following the Russian Guards' defeat, soldiers piling rocks and frozen earth into hasty breastworks that provided minimal cover but improved defensive capability. When Bagration's assault reached 200 yards, Saint-Hilaire's entire division fired simultaneously. The volley dropped perhaps 400 Russians in seconds. The survivors loaded, aimed, fired again before the Russians could respond. Bagration's troops charged the final 150 yards under continuous musket fire. The mathematics of assault were brutal. Advancing soldiers travelled 150 yards in perhaps 45 seconds, while defenders fired 3 volleys. Each volley killed or wounded 10% of the attacking force, 30% casualties before bayonets ever crossed. The Russians who reached French positions were already depleted, exhausted, facing fresh troops fighting from elevated, fortified ground. The bayonet fight on the southern heights lasted 8 minutes. Russian grenadiers broke through French lines in 3 places, creating salients that penetrated 50 yards into Saint-Hilaire's position. French reserves counterattacked immediately. Companies held back for exactly this crisis, hitting the Russian penetrations from both flanks. The salients became killing zones where Russians fought surrounded, taking fire from 3 directions, unable to retreat or advance. Bagration's elite units died in clusters, still maintaining formation discipline even as they were systematically annihilated. The counterattack failed at 11:15 a.m. Bagration's 9,000 troops retreated with perhaps 3,000 casualties, including most of his officer corps. The survivors withdrew south toward the village of Augezd, maintaining enough cohesion to discourage French pursuit, but clearly shattered as an offensive force. The last realistic chance to retake the Pratzen Heights had died in those 8 minutes of desperate bayonet fighting. Marshal Davout seized the initiative on the southern flank. His corps had absorbed Russian assaults all morning, losing perhaps 4,000 men while holding impossible positions. Now the pressure was gone. Russian forces that had been attacking him were retreating or pinned down by artillery from the heights. Davout ordered his corps to advance. French infantry who'd spent 3 hours defending suddenly became attackers, pursuing disorganized Russian units that no longer had a clear command structure or coherent objectives. The pursuit turned into massacre. Russian soldiers retreating from Davout collided with Russian units withdrawing from Bagration's failed counterattack. Two separate forces tried to occupy the same roads and fields, creating chaos that made organized resistance impossible. French cavalry under General Margarin exploited every opening, charging into confused Russian formations and cutting down soldiers who couldn't form squares fast enough to defend against mounted attack. Dokhturov attempted to rally his forces near Augest village, but French artillery from the heights maintained constant fire on any concentration of Russian troops. The 12-pounders could reach 100-200 yards with acceptable accuracy. Every time Dokhturov's officers assembled a battalion, French cannonballs scattered it before cohesion could be established. The Russian southern force was disintegrating not from single catastrophic defeat, but from accumulated breakdown of every system that made armies functional. Napoleon ordered Soult to pivot south and attack downhill off the heights. The fresh divisions of Vandamme and Legrand, having secured the plateau, now descended its southern slopes to hit Russian forces from the flank. This transformed the tactical picture completely. What had been Russian offensive against Davout's line became French offensive from three directions. Soult from the heights, Davout from the west, and Margarin's cavalry from the southwest, all converging on Russian forces that had nowhere to retreat except south toward frozen lakes. The Satchen Ponds lay 2 miles south of the Pratzen Heights, a series of interconnected lakes, frozen in December, but the ice wasn't strong enough to support artillery or mass troop movements. Russian forces retreating south had 3 routes: roads around the western lake shore, roads around the eastern shore, or direct routes across the ice that promised speed but risked catastrophe. Officers made split-second decisions based on incomplete information and mounting panic. General Przybyszewski commanded a Russian division that tried crossing the ice at 11:45 a.m. His 4,000 troops spread across the frozen surface in column formation, maintaining military organization even in retreat. The ice held for the first 1,000 men. Then French artillery on the heights began ranging shots on the lakes. The first rounds missed, impacting ice 200 yards from Russian columns. Gun crews adjusted elevation. The second salvo landed directly among Przybyszewski's troops. Cannonballs travelling at 1,000 feet per second don't need to hit soldiers to kill them when fired at ice. The kinetic energy transfers to the frozen surface, creating shock waves that crack ice in radiating patterns. One well-placed shot could compromise structural integrity across 50 square yards. Multiple shots created cascading failure, where ice that seemed solid became a lattice of fractures, waiting for sufficient weight to complete the collapse. The ice began breaking at 11:52 a.m. Not catastrophically at first. Small cracks, water seeping through, soldiers feeling the surface shift under their boots. Then a 12-pound cannonball landed among a Russian regiment in the centre of the lake, and the ice failed completely. 300 men plunged into water so cold that shock stopped hearts before drowning could. Survivors on still solid ice watched their comrades disappear into black water, faces frozen in expressions of surprise before they sank beneath the surface. Panic spread through Russian units on the ice faster than the structural collapse. Soldiers broke formation and ran for the nearest shore, abandoning equipment to move faster. The weight shift accelerated the failure. Men running created dynamic loading that solid ice could absorb but fractured ice could not. More sections gave way. More soldiers drowned. The retreat across the Satchen Ponds became a drowning event witnessed by both armies from shore. French artillery continued firing at the lakes, not because they needed to, the ice was already failing, but because orders hadn't been countermanded and gunners had clear targets. Some cannonballs hit men still struggling in the water, killing them instantly or pushing them under with the splash impact. Other rounds shattered ice that was still holding, creating new zones of collapse where soldiers had been seconds from reaching safety. Russian units that hadn't attempted the ice crossing watched the disaster and chose overland routes despite knowing French cavalry controlled those approaches. Better to fight and maybe die than drown helplessly in freezing water. Cohesive Russian formations became rare by noon. Most troops scattered into company or platoon-sized groups just trying to escape the battlefield alive. Allied command structure disintegrated. Tsar Alexander had lost contact with most of his southern army. Austrian Emperor Francis was evacuating his headquarters as French forces advanced. Individual Russian generals made independent decisions without coordination, some ordering continued resistance while others authorized retreat. The result was chaos where adjacent units executed contradictory orders, some fighting while others fled past them. Marshal Lannes exploited the confusion on the northern flank. His corps had been demonstrating against Allied right-wing positions all morning, making enough noise to prevent Russian reinforcements from shifting south. Now, with the southern Allied force shattered, Lannes attacked in earnest. His 18,000 troops hit Russian positions that had thinned as commanders pulled units to deal with crises elsewhere. The Allied northern line buckled immediately. Prince Liechtenstein commanded Austrian cavalry on the northern flank, elite cuirassier regiments in steel breastplates, the most expensive troops in the Austrian military. He'd held them in reserve all morning, waiting for the decisive moment to charge. That moment never came because the battle had already been decided 3 miles south. Now French infantry was overrunning his positions and Liechtenstein faced the choice of committing his cavalry to a lost battle or preserving them for future campaigns. He chose preservation. The Austrian cuirassiers withdrew northeast without engaging, abandoning Russian allies who'd counted on cavalry support. The Russian northern force retreated at 12:30 p.m., not routed but clearly defeated, maintaining enough organisation to discourage close pursuit. They withdrew toward Austerlitz village, collecting stragglers, trying to reform something resembling an army from the wreckage of the morning's fighting. French pursuit was cautious. Lannes had achieved his objective of pinning the Allied right, and wasn't going to risk his corps in reckless attacks against troops that might still be dangerous if cornered. Napoleon observed the battlefield from the Pratzen Heights and recognized the moment for pursuit versus consolidation. His army had achieved stunning tactical victory, but was exhausted from 8 hours of continuous combat. Further attacks risked overextension and potential reversal if Allied forces rallied. The intelligent move was consolidating control of the battlefield, collecting prisoners and captured equipment, letting the enemy retreat while French forces reorganized. But Napoleon also understood that decisive victories required pursuit. Defeated armies that escaped intact could rebuild and fight again. The strategic goal wasn't just winning this battle, but destroying the Allied coalition's capacity to continue the war. That required pressing the advantage while Russian forces were still disorganized and demoralized. He ordered general advance, all corps to pursue retreating Allied units, inflicting maximum casualties, preventing any possibility of rally or reorganization. French cavalry took the lead in pursuit. Murat's squadrons had spent the morning screening the French centre, finally unleashed for the role cavalry excelled at, chasing broken infantry. Mounted troops caught Russian formations that had lost cohesion, charging from multiple directions, forcing squares that then became targets for French artillery following the advance. Cavalry couldn't break properly formed infantry squares, but they could pin them in place while other arms destroyed them. The pursuit turned the afternoon into extended slaughter. Small unit actions scattered across 10 miles of Moravian countryside. French cavalry overrunning Russian artillery batteries, infantry mopping up pockets of resistance, captured Allied soldiers being herded toward collection points. This wasn't glorious warfare but brutal cleanup, killing soldiers who could no longer effectively fight back but remained dangerous if allowed to escape. Allied casualties mounted exponentially during the pursuit phase. Soldiers who'd survived the morning's battles died in afternoon skirmishes that had no names, no commemorations, no witnesses except those who killed them. The official casualty counts would never capture this reality. Men shot while surrendering because their captors couldn't spare troops to guard prisoners, wounded abandoned to freeze overnight because medical services were overwhelmed, stragglers hunted down by cavalry patrols and cut down without ceremony. By 2 p.m. the battlefield belonged entirely to Napoleon. French forces controlled the Pratzen Heights, Augest village, both shores of the Sachsen ponds, and most of the roads leading east toward Austerlitz. Allied forces still capable of resistance had retreated beyond artillery range, scattered into regimental-sized groups with no unified command. Tsar Alexander had evacuated to Austerlitz itself, setting up temporary headquarters in a church while his staff tried to determine how many of his army remained intact. The victory was total. Napoleon had executed a battle plan so precise that historians would study it for centuries. The deception, the timing, the coordination of multiple corps across miles of terrain. Austerlitz represented the theoretical perfection of Napoleonic warfare, where inferior numbers defeated superior forces through positional advantage and operational brilliance. Military academies would teach this battle as the standard for how great generals operated, but the cost was staggering. French casualties by 2 p.m. numbered roughly 9,000, killed, wounded, or missing. Most of the killed had died in the morning fighting on the heights, or during Davout's desperate defence. Most of the wounded would die in coming days from infection, because Napoleonic-era medicine couldn't treat traumatic injuries effectively. The 9,000 casualties represented over 12% of Napoleon's army, losses that would require months to replace. Allied casualties were catastrophic. Russian forces had lost approximately 21,000 men, 1/4 of their entire army. Austrian casualties added another 6,000. The combined 27,000 losses included thousands drowned in the Sachsen ponds, thousands captured during the pursuit, and thousands wounded who'd freeze to death overnight because medical services had completely broken down. Entire regiments had been destroyed, not just defeated but annihilated, their colours captured, their survivors too few to rebuild the unit. The Russian Imperial Guard, which had never been defeated in battle, had lost 200 men and its reputation. Russian artillery had abandoned over 180 guns during the retreat, massive loss of equipment that represented years of investment. Austrian forces had effectively ceased to exist as a military factor. The army that fought at Austerlitz would never recover its strength or morale. Napoleon walked the battlefield as the sun began its descent toward winter horizon. Bodies covered the ground in patterns that told the story of each engagement. Neat rows where artillery had struck formed columns, scattered clusters where cavalry had caught fleeing infantry, tangled heaps where bayonet charges had turned into desperate hand-to-hand fighting. The dead lay frozen in their final positions, expressions preserved by cold that stopped decomposition. The wounded screamed for water, for help, for death. French medical corps tried to reach them, but thousands of casualties overwhelmed the available surgeons. Triage became brutal. Men who might survive received treatment. Men with gut wounds or shattered limbs were given opium and left to die. The medical tents became slaughterhouses where surgeons amputated limbs in assembly line fashion, moving from patient to patient while orderlies threw severed arms and legs into piles outside. Russian wounded received no treatment at all unless they could walk to French aid stations. The Russian medical service had evacuated with the retreating army, leaving thousands of injured soldiers scattered across the battlefield. Many would freeze to death overnight. Others would be found days later by burial parties, still alive but beyond medical help. Napoleonic warfare was indifferent to suffering. Strategic objectives mattered. Individual agony did not. Napoleon's soldiers celebrated their victory even while exhaustion made movement difficult. They defeated two empires in a single day, proving again that French revolutionary armies were superior to aristocratic forces fighting for kings who bought their loyalty. The celebration was muted by losses. Every regiment had dead friends to mourn, but the sense of achievement was undeniable. They'd participated in military history's most perfect battle. The emperor returned to his headquarters as darkness fell. His marshals reported casualty figures, captured equipment, estimated enemy losses. The numbers confirmed what battlefield observation suggested. Total victory, Allied coalition shattered, French position in Europe secured. Napoleon listened to the reports and began planning his next moves. Battlefield victory was temporary unless converted into political advantage. Austria would need to be forced into peace treaty that permanently reduced its power. Russia would need to be pushed so far east it couldn't threaten French interests. Prussia would need to be intimidated into continued neutrality. The Battle of Austerlitz had lasted roughly 9 hours. In that time, Napoleon had destroyed an army, broken a coalition, and reshaped European power dynamics for the next decade. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of military art. But masterpieces are painted in blood, and December 2nd, 1805 had consumed enough blood to fill the Sachan ponds 3 times over. Tsar Alexander wept in the Austerlitz church at 3 p.m. 28 years old, absolute ruler of Russia, convinced that morning he was about to become Europe's saviour. Now his army was shattered, his reputation destroyed, his military judgment exposed as catastrophically inadequate. Courtiers who'd spent the previous evening flattering his strategic genius now avoided eye contact. The young Tsar had gambled everything on personal glory and lost in the most public, humiliating way possible. General Kutuzov arrived at the church with what remained of organised Russian forces. Perhaps 40,000 troops still capable of following orders compared to the 85,000 who'd started the day. The missing 45,000 were dead, wounded, captured, or scattered across Moravia without officers or cohesion. Kutuzov's preliminary casualty estimate suggested 15,000 dead, 12,000 wounded, 18,000 missing. The missing category included men who'd simply walked away from their units during the chaos, deserters who'd decided survival mattered more than serving a Tsar whose incompetence had nearly gotten them killed. Austrian Emperor Francis received news of the disaster in his evacuated headquarters 15 miles east of the battlefield. His reaction was more pragmatic than Alexander's emotional collapse. Austria had lost wars to France before. This was the 3rd major defeat in a decade. Francis understood that continued resistance was impossible. His army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. His treasury was empty. His nobles were questioning why they should sacrifice their sons for an emperor who couldn't win battles. Peace was necessary regardless of the terms Napoleon would demand. Francis dispatched envoys to Napoleon's headquarters at 4 p.m, requesting immediate armistice. The message was carefully worded to suggest Austria desired peace without explicitly admitting defeat, though everyone understood the reality. Napoleon received the Austrian request with satisfaction. He'd broken one empire and forced it to beg for mercy in a single day. The terms he'd demand would reshape Central Europe's power structure permanently. The pursuit continued even as diplomatic negotiations began. Marshal Murat's cavalry ranged 15 miles beyond the battlefield, hunting Russian stragglers and capturing supply trains. French dragoons overran a Russian artillery park at 4:30 p.m, seizing 40 guns that had been abandoned when their crews fled. The captured weapons represented months of production from Russian foundries, equipment that would take a year to replace. Each captured gun weakened Russia's capacity to continue the war. Russian rearguards attempted to establish defensive positions east of Austerlitz, but French pressure prevented effective fortification. Lannes' corps pushed forward relentlessly, accepting casualties to maintain momentum, preventing Russian forces from rallying into coherent formations. The strategic imperative was clear. Every hour of continued pursuit made Russian recovery less likely, increased the probability they'd have to accept humiliating peace terms. Napoleon ordered Soult to occupy Austerlitz itself at 5 p.m. The town held symbolic importance as the battle's namesake and practical value as a road junction controlling routes eastward. Soult's exhausted troops marched into Austerlitz against minimal resistance. A few Russian rearguard companies that fired hasty volleys and withdrew. By 5:30 p.m. the tricolour flew over Austerlitz's town hall, replacing the Imperial Russian banners that had flown there that morning. The occupation of Austerlitz forced Tsar Alexander to evacuate again. His temporary headquarters in the church became untenable with French troops entering the town. Alexander's staff organised another retreat, this one to Göding 20 miles further east. The young Tsar mounted his horse in darkness, surrounded by Cossack guards, fleeing from an enemy whose tactical genius had made Russian numerical superiority irrelevant. The humiliation was complete. French soldiers began looting as night fell. They'd been fighting since dawn with minimal food, surviving on adrenaline and revolutionary fervour. Now victory and exhaustion combined to break discipline. Troops ransacked Austrian villages looking for food, wine, anything valuable enough to steal. Officers attempted to maintain order but couldn't be everywhere. The Grand Army, so perfectly disciplined during battle, became a mob of hungry men taking whatever they could find. The looting extended to fallen soldiers. French troops stripped Russian and Austrian corpses of anything useful: boots, coats, weapons, coins. This was standard practice in Napoleonic warfare, considered legitimate salvage rather than desecration. The dead had no use for their possessions. The living needed boots that weren't falling apart and coats that still kept out cold. Practical necessity overrode sentiment about respecting the fallen. Russian wounded abandoned on the battlefield faced the worst fate. Temperature dropped below freezing after sunset. Injured soldiers who might have survived with medical treatment instead froze to death overnight. Some tried crawling toward fires they saw in the distance, leaving blood trails across snow. Most died where they'd fallen, hypothermia shutting down their bodies while they remained conscious enough to understand what was happening. Death from cold is not gentle. Austrian civilians fled villages near the battlefield, correctly anticipating that occupying armies didn't distinguish between enemy soldiers and enemy population. Families loaded wagons with whatever possessions they could carry and drove east through freezing darkness, joining streams of refugees that clogged every road. The civilian toll from Austerlitz would never be accurately calculated. Families that died of exposure during the flight, villages that starved after armies seized their food supplies, women raped by soldiers from both sides who saw civilians as targets rather than people requiring protection. Napoleon established his headquarters in Austerlitz's finest building, a manor house abandoned by its Austrian owner. He requisitioned the best room, had maps spread across tables, called his marshals to conference. The battle was won, but the campaign continued. Russian forces were retreating but still intact. Prussian armies watched from the north, waiting to see if intervention might still be profitable. British gold continued funding the coalition. Military victory had to be converted into political settlement before the strategic situation could shift again. Marshal Berthier presented updated casualty figures at 8 p.m. French losses: 1,305 killed, 6,191 wounded, 573 missing. Total 8,169. slightly better than preliminary estimates, but still representing 12% of the army. Every casualty was a trained soldier who'd cost the Republic months of drilling and equipping. Replacing these losses would strain France's manpower system, already stressed by 15 years of continuous warfare. Victory had been expensive despite its decisiveness. Allied casualty reports were more fragmentary because Russian and Austrian record-keeping had collapsed during the retreat. Best estimates suggested 16,000 Russian dead or mortally wounded, 20,000 Russian captured or missing, 4,000 Austrian dead or wounded, 3,000 Austrian captured. Combined losses of 43,000 from an army of 85,000, 50% casualties, far beyond the threshold where armies cease to exist as functional military organizations. The Third Coalition's field army had been destroyed in a single day. Equipment losses multiplied the disaster. The Allies had abandoned 186 cannons during their retreat, roughly 60% of their total artillery. Each gun represented massive investment in bronze, skilled labour, transportation infrastructure to move multi-ton weapons across Europe. Russian artillery factories would need 18 months to replace these losses. Austrian foundries were already working at capacity and couldn't increase production. The material cost of Austerlitz would cripple Allied military capability for years. Russian prisoners overwhelmed French capacity to handle them. 20,000 captured soldiers needed food, shelter, guards, medical care for the wounded among them. Napoleon's army could barely feed itself. Adding 20,000 prisoners to the logistics requirements was impossible. The solution was brutal pragmatism. Wounded prisoners received minimal treatment. Those who couldn't walk were left where they fell. Healthy prisoners were force-marched to rear areas under minimal guard. Thousands died during these marches from exhaustion, hunger, or opportunistic killings by guards who saw prisoners as burdens rather than valuable leverage. French medical services collapsed under casualties from both sides. The army had perhaps 50 surgeons for 73,000 troops, adequate for normal operations but catastrophically insufficient for major battle. Each surgeon faced hundreds of casualties requiring treatment. Amputations alone took 15 minutes per patient. Simple mathematics meant most wounded soldiers received no care at all. They lay in barns and churches converted to field hospitals, waiting for attention that would never come, dying from blood loss or shock while surgeons worked frantically on whoever seemed most likely to survive. The horror of Napoleonic-era medicine became apparent in these improvised hospitals. Surgeons operated without anesthesia beyond alcohol and opium. They reused instruments without sterilization because germ theory wouldn't be discovered for another 50 years. Infection killed more soldiers than battlefield wounds. Gangrene, tetanus, sepsis turning survivable injuries into death sentences. Soldiers feared field hospitals more than combat because hospitals meant screaming and soaring and dying slowly instead of the quick death a musket ball offered. Marshal Davout's corps had suffered disproportionately during the morning's desperate defence. His 3 divisions had absorbed repeated Russian assaults, while outnumbered 3-1. Casualty rates in some regiments exceeded 40%. The 108th Line Infantry had started the day with 2,400 troops and ended it with 2,300 effectives. The survivors were heroes who'd held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. They were also traumatized men who'd watched half their friends die in front of them. Davout toured his corps' positions after dark, visiting units, thanking officers, trying to maintain morale among troops who'd earned victory through suffering. He found soldiers sitting around fires too exhausted to celebrate, staring into flames without speaking. Combat trauma wasn't understood in 1805. There were no terms like PTSD, no recognition that psychological wounds were as real as physical ones. Soldiers who couldn't function after battle were considered cowards, shot if they refused to fight again, left to cope alone if they maintained enough discipline to stay in ranks. The Russian army retreated through the night toward Hungary. Officers tried to maintain formation and discipline, but control was fragmentary. Many regiments had lost most of their officers during the fighting. Junior sergeants commanded battalions, corporals led companies. The retreat became increasingly chaotic as darkness and exhaustion compounded organizational breakdown. Russian forces that had marched into Austria as a disciplined army scattered into armed bands barely distinguishable from brigands. French cavalry harassed the retreat throughout the night. Murat's squadrons attacked Russian columns at road junctions, forcing them to deploy into defensive formations, delaying their movement, inflicting casualties through hit-and-run tactics. The Russians couldn't ignore these attacks because any French cavalry might be the advance guard of a larger force. Each pause to defend meant more time for French infantry to close the distance. The retreat became a running battle that never allowed Russian forces to rest or reorganize. Cossack cavalry fought rearguard actions with suicidal courage, buying time for Russian infantry to escape. These mounted irregulars weren't part of the regular army. They were frontier warriors who'd sworn service to the Tsar in exchange for land and plunder rights. Cossacks viewed warfare differently than European regulars, embracing tactics that regular armies considered dishonorable. They ambushed French cavalry patrols, killed stragglers, burned bridges after Russian forces passed. Their rearguard actions saved thousands of Russian soldiers from capture, but cost the Cossacks heavily. Entire sotnias disappeared during the night's fighting. Napoleon received Austrian peace envoys at 10 p.m. Prince Johann von Liechtenstein arrived under flag of truce, authorized by Emperor Francis to negotiate immediate armistice. Napoleon made the prince wait 2 hours before granting audience, a calculated insult that emphasized Austria's defeated status. When negotiations finally began, Napoleon's terms were harsh. Austria would cede all territory in Italy and southern Germany, pay massive indemnity, reduce its army to minimal strength, accept permanent French garrisons on Austrian soil. Liechtenstein protested that such terms were impossibly punitive, that Austria would never accept conditions that essentially ended its status as a great power. Napoleon's response was direct. The alternative was continued war, French armies marching on Vienna, total destruction of what remained of Austrian military forces. Austria could accept humiliating peace or catastrophic annihilation. The choice was obvious. Liechtenstein requested time to communicate terms to Emperor Francis. Napoleon granted 12 hours, knowing Francis had no real options. The Austrian capitulation was unfolding exactly as Napoleon had calculated. Austerlitz hadn't just defeated an army, it had broken an empire's will to resist. Austria would sign whatever peace treaty France demanded because the alternative was national extinction. One battle had achieved what years of war couldn't: the permanent reduction of Austria from rival to subordinate. Russian forces were different. Tsar Alexander commanded resources that made temporary military defeat irrelevant. Russia had millions of potential soldiers, vast territory where armies could retreat and regroup, British financial support to rebuild shattered forces. Napoleon had won a tactical masterpiece, but strategic victory over Russia required either destroying their army completely or forcing a peace settlement before they recovered. The pursuit would continue until one of those conditions was met. French troops settled into captured positions as midnight approached. They built fires from looted furniture, cooked food stolen from Austrian farms, tried to sleep despite cold that penetrated every garment. Tomorrow they'd resume the advance, chasing Russian forces deeper into Eastern Europe, extending supply lines until something broke. Modern warfare was industrial, not just the fighting but the logistics, the administration, the systematic application of violence across continental distances. The night after Austerlitz was quiet except for the screaming. wounded men crying for help that wouldn't come, horses with shattered legs whinnying until soldiers shot them, scavengers, human and animal, moving across the battlefield taking whatever had value. This was victory's aftermath, the reality that propaganda never mentioned. Glory existed in paintings and dispatches. Reality was frozen corpses and crying men, and the smell of shit and blood that would linger for weeks until winter storms buried the evidence. Napoleon slept 4 hours that night. When he woke at 4 a.m. on December 3rd, he immediately began planning the next phase. Austerlitz was finished, but the campaign continued. Orders went to marshals: continue pursuit, prevent Russian rally, pressure them toward final capitulation. Messages went to Paris: victory announcement, casualty figures, demands for reinforcements and supplies. Diplomatic communications went to neutral powers: Prussia, Sweden, Turkey, all calculating whether to join the winning side or maintain cautious neutrality. The machine Napoleon had built, administrative, military, diplomatic, operated with mechanical efficiency. One battle was just an input into systems designed to win wars and reshape continents. Austerlitz mattered because it demonstrated French military superiority so overwhelming that further resistance seemed pointless. The Third Coalition would collapse not just from military defeat, but from psychological realization that fighting Napoleon was futile. But machines require fuel. The Grand Army needed food, ammunition, replacement equipment, reinforcements. French military logistics were straining under demands of occupying half of Europe, while conducting active campaigns against multiple enemies. Every mile deeper into Eastern Europe extended supply lines, increased vulnerability to interdiction, raised the probability that operational success would become strategic overreach. Napoleon understood these limitations but believed speed and audacity could overcome them. This assumption would eventually destroy him, but in December 1805 it still seemed brilliant. The sun rose on December 3rd over a battlefield that no longer existed. The wounded had mostly died overnight. The dead were freezing into the ground. The armies had moved on. What remained was empty terrain marked by bloodstains and abandoned equipment, testimony to the day when 158,000 men had fought for control of hills and streams whose names nobody would remember except as references to one of history's most perfect battles. The Sachin ponds on December 3rd contained more corpses than water. French engineers surveyed the lakes at dawn, calculating recovery operations for bodies trapped beneath ice and equipment abandoned during yesterday's panic. What they found defied initial casualty estimates. The ice had claimed far more victims than anyone watching from shore had realized. Major Lejeune led the recovery detail with 3 companies of engineers. His orders were practical rather than humanitarian: recover French equipment, count enemy dead for official reports, assess whether the lakes could be used for winter water supply. The third objective became impossible within minutes of beginning the survey. Bodies contaminated every section of accessible water. Hundreds of Russian soldiers had drowned in the initial collapse. Hundreds more had died from hypothermia after falling through but surviving long enough to freeze. The ice told its story through evidence that would horrify the recovery teams for the rest of their lives. Faces visible beneath the surface, mouths open in final screams, hands reaching upward as if trying to claw through to air. Equipment scattered across the frozen surface, muskets, backpacks, helmets marking where soldiers had tried shedding weight to stay afloat. The desperation was preserved in ice like insects in amber, a permanent record of the worst single incident of the battle. Lejeune's engineers broke through ice in sections, using axes and poles to create openings where bodies could be recovered. The work was grotesque. Corpses that had been submerged 12 hours were already decomposing despite the cold. Faces had bloated, skin had turned grey-green. Gases had built up in body cavities, making the dead buoyant but distorted. Soldiers dragging these bodies from the water vomited repeatedly, but continued working because orders were orders. The official count reached 2,000 drowned by noon. This number excluded bodies trapped beneath ice too thick to break, soldiers who'd sunk to the bottom in the deepest sections, men who'd escaped the initial drowning but died from hypothermia on shore. Realistic estimates suggested 3,000 total deaths directly attributable to the Sachin ponds, more casualties than any single engagement of the battle, except the morning fight for the Pratzen Heights. Russian survivors of the drowning incident had scattered during the night, joining the general retreat toward Hungary. Many suffered from severe hypothermia that would kill them days later when their bodies finally surrendered to the cold they'd endured. Others had psychological trauma that made them combat ineffective. Soldiers who'd seen half their regiment drown couldn't be trusted to maintain formation under fire. The Sachin ponds had destroyed units not just through immediate deaths, but through permanent damage to survivors. Napoleon toured the lakes at 1 p.m., accompanied by marshals and staff officers. He had ordered the artillery bombardment that shattered the ice, understanding that thousands would drown as direct result. Military necessity had demanded preventing Russian escape, even if the method was horrific. Napoleon showed no emotion viewing the recovery operations. Dead enemies were preferable to living ones who might regroup and fight again. The moral calculus of warfare was simple. French lives mattered, enemy lives didn't. Marshal Soult questioned whether the artillery bombardment had been necessary. The Russian forces on the ice were already in full retreat, disorganized and combat ineffective. Allowing them to escape would have achieved the same strategic result without the massacre. Napoleon's response was instructive about his approach to warfare. Deliberately horrific actions created psychological impact beyond their immediate tactical effect. Russian soldiers who survived Austerlitz would remember comrades drowning in frozen lakes. That memory would spread, creating fear that degraded future Russian military effectiveness. The psychological warfare aspect of the Sachin ponds incident was calculated and intentional. Napoleon wanted the Third Coalition to understand that fighting France meant total war without mercy. Conventional military defeat was bad enough. Annihilation was terrifying. Future enemies would remember Austerlitz and hesitate before challenging French power. Terror as strategic weapon was older than civilization, but Napoleon weaponized it with industrial efficiency. French soldiers participating in the recovery operations had different reactions than their emperor. These were men who'd fought battles across Europe, who'd killed enemies at bayonet range, who'd seen death in every form warfare offered. Even they were disturbed by the scale of the Sachin drownings. Killing armed soldiers in combat was one thing. Watching thousands drown helplessly while you fired artillery at them crossed lines even hardened veterans recognized. Corporal Marbeau from the 23rd Chasseurs à Cheval wrote in his journal that night about the recovery operations. His account described pulling bodies from the water for 6 hours straight, the weight of waterlogged uniforms, the way frozen limbs broke when handled roughly. Marbot had fought at Marengo and Ulm without psychological impact. The Sachin ponds gave him nightmares for years. He wasn't alone. Many French soldiers involved in the recovery developed what modern medicine would recognize as trauma disorders. Austrian civilians from nearby villages were conscripted to assist with body disposal. The French army couldn't spare troops for burial details when pursuit of Russian forces continued. Local residents spent December 3rd and 4th digging mass graves in frozen ground, dragging corpses from temporary storage areas, burning bodies too badly damaged for burial. The work was forced labour under threat of military punishment. Austrians who'd had nothing to do with the battle found themselves disposing of its aftermath. The mass graves near the Sachan ponds would remain visible for decades, slight depressions in the ground where earth had settled after bodies decomposed, creating permanent markers of where 2,000 Russian soldiers were buried in trenches dug by Austrian villagers under French military supervision. No monuments, no markers, no records of individual names. They drowned as soldiers and were buried as anonymous corpses. Equipment recovery from the lakes proved nearly impossible. Muskets and artillery pieces had sunk to the bottom, buried in mud that would preserve them until the 20th century, when metal detectors would locate dozens of Russian weapons still in the lake bed. Leather equipment had floated initially, but became waterlogged and sank. Cloth standards and flags were recoverable, but so damaged by water that they had minimal value as trophies. The material losses from the drowning were almost as significant as the human casualties. Austrian Emperor Francis signed the armistice at 3 p.m. on December 3rd. Prince Liechtenstein delivered the signed document to Napoleon's headquarters with visible humiliation. The terms were devastating. Austria would cede Venetia, Istria and Dalmatia to French-controlled Italy, surrender Tyrol to Bavaria, accept French occupation of key fortresses, pay 40 million francs in war indemnity. The treaty reduced Austria from great power to French satellite in a single stroke. The speed of Austrian capitulation shocked European diplomatic circles. 48 hours from battle to peace settlement was unprecedented in modern warfare. Traditional European conflicts involved months of negotiation after major battles, careful diplomacy preserving defeated nations' dignity. Napoleon dispensed with diplomatic niceties and imposed terms like a conqueror dealing with conquered territory. The message was clear. Fighting France meant total submission if you lost. Russian forces continued retreating eastward despite the Austrian armistice. Tsar Alexander refused to negotiate while French armies remained on campaign. His pride couldn't accept the humiliation of begging for peace after the disaster he'd personally orchestrated. Russian military doctrine emphasized strategic depth, the ability to retreat indefinitely into vast territory, where supply problems would eventually stop any invader. Alexander planned to withdraw to Poland, rebuild his army, continue the war with British financial support. Napoleon faced a strategic dilemma. Pursuing the Russians deeper into Eastern Europe meant extending supply lines that were already strained. Winter conditions were deteriorating daily, temperature dropping, roads becoming impassable, foraging opportunities disappearing as the army moved into regions already stripped by Russian scorched earth retreats. Military logic suggested halting the pursuit and consolidating control of conquered territory. Political logic demanded crushing Russia completely before they could rebuild. Marshal Berthier presented logistics assessments at 5 p.m. on December 3rd. The Grand Army could sustain operations in Moravia for another 2 weeks with existing supplies. Advancing into Hungary or Poland required either establishing new supply depots, which took months, or living off the land in regions that couldn't support 70,000 troops. The mathematics of military logistics were unforgiving. Armies moved on food and ammunition. Without both, they ceased to exist regardless of tactical brilliance. Napoleon ordered the pursuit to continue for 1 more week. He'd push Russian forces as far east as supply lines allowed, inflict maximum casualties, then halt and consolidate. The strategic goal was destroying Russia's capacity to threaten French interest for at least 18 months, long enough to secure Austria's submission, intimidate Prussia into neutrality, and reorganize French-controlled Europe into a stable imperial system. 1 more week of pursuit might achieve that goal. French cavalry under Murat caught retreating Russian forces at Göding on December 4th. A sharp engagement lasting 2 hours resulted in 800 Russian casualties and capture of another 1,500 prisoners. The Russians withdrew in disorder, abandoning supply wagons and artillery that slowed their retreat. Murat's dragoons pursued for another 10 miles before darkness ended the chase. The running battle demonstrated that Russian forces were still disorganized, still vulnerable, still capable of being destroyed if pressure continued. Russian General Bagration attempted to organize coherent rear guard at Nikolsburg, but lacked sufficient troops. His elite advance guard had been shattered during the failed counterattack on the Pratzen Heights. Replacement units were recent conscripts, or line infantry exhausted from the retreat. Bagration deployed these forces in defensive positions, but knew they couldn't hold against determined French assault. The best he could hope for was delaying French advance long enough for main Russian army to escape complete annihilation. The battle at Nikolsburg on December 5th lasted 6 hours. Bagration's 8,000 troops occupied a ridgeline defending the road to Hungary. Lanner's corps attacked with 15,000 troops supported by 40 guns. The Russian position was strong, but French numerical superiority and artillery dominance made the outcome inevitable. Bagration's forces held until 2 p.m., then withdrew after suffering 2,000 casualties. The retreat was orderly, a professional operation that saved most of Bagration's army, but conceded the battlefield and the road network to French control. Napoleon reached Nikolsburg on December the 6th and established temporary headquarters. From here he could see the strategic landscape clearly. Russian forces were retreating toward Poland approximately 40 miles northeast. Austrian territories were occupied and pacified under French military administration. Prussian armies watched from the north, but showed no inclination to intervene. The military campaign was essentially won, even though final Russian capitulation hadn't been achieved. Diplomatic communications from St. Petersburg arrived on December 7th. Tsar Alexander wasn't offering peace, but he was requesting negotiations, a subtle distinction that preserved Russian dignity while acknowledging military reality. The young Tsar proposed meeting with Napoleon personally to discuss terms. This was remarkable development. Russian emperors didn't negotiate directly with foreign leaders unless acknowledging near-equal status. Alexander's willingness to meet suggested the psychological impact of Austerlitz had broken Russian confidence completely. Napoleon agreed to personal meeting, understanding that Alexander's presence gave him opportunity to humiliate the Russian Tsar publicly. The psychological warfare that had begun with the Sachsen Pons would continue through diplomatic theatre. Napoleon would demonstrate French superiority not just militarily but personally, showing that the revolutionary upstart from Corsica was superior in every way to the hereditary Russian autocrat. The meeting was scheduled for December 12th, at a location between the two armies. French and Russian forces would maintain positions but cease hostilities during negotiations. The arrangement was temporary truce rather than armistice. Both sides prepared to resume fighting if talks failed. Napoleon used the pause to reorganize his forces, bring up supplies, and prepare for either renewed campaign or occupation duties depending on negotiation outcomes. French casualties from the pursuit operations December 3rd through 7th totaled approximately 600 killed and wounded. Russian losses during the same period exceeded 5,000. The disparity reflected demoralization. Russian troops were fighting retreat actions without conviction, while French forces maintained aggressive pursuit. Morale differential was as decisive as tactical advantage in determining casualties during this phase of the campaign. The human cost of Austerlitz and its aftermath was approaching catastrophic scale. French total casualties, 9,500. Russian casualties, 27,000 including killed, wounded, captured and missing. Austrian casualties, 7,000. Combined losses exceeded 43,000 from armies that had totaled 158,000 5 days earlier. More than 1/4 of all soldiers who'd participated in the battle were now dead, wounded beyond recovery, or captured. The casualty rate exceeded any battle in European history to that point. Medical facilities were completely overwhelmed. French field hospitals held 7,000 wounded requiring care. Russian wounded numbered perhaps 12,000, but most had been abandoned during the retreat. Austrian wounded totaled 4,000, many being treated by their own medical services, which had remained behind after the armistice. The 23,000 total wounded represented an impossible burden on Napoleonic-era medicine. Most would die in coming weeks from infection, gangrene, or complications from untreated injuries. The psychological trauma extended beyond physical casualties. Soldiers who'd survived the battle without physical wounds carried mental scars that 1805 medicine didn't recognize or treat. Men who'd watched friends drown in the Sachin ponds developed symptoms modern psychiatry would identify as PTSD. Soldiers who'd held impossible positions against overwhelming odds experienced survivors' guilt. The trauma was real but invisible, suffered in silence because military culture offered no framework for acknowledging psychological damage. Civilian casualties remained uncounted and mostly ignored by military authorities. Austrian villagers killed during the fighting, refugees who died of exposure during flight, women raped by occupying soldiers. These victims appeared in no official tallies. Military history recorded armies' movements and casualties, but erased the civilian suffering that accompanied every campaign. The true cost of Austerlitz would never be known because half the victims weren't considered worthy of documentation. Napoleon's victory was absolute by any military measure. He destroyed the Third Coalition's field army, forced Austria to humiliating peace, brought Russia to negotiating table under conditions that acknowledged French dominance. Austerlitz represented the apex of Napoleonic military achievement, the moment when his genius appeared unlimited and his empire seemed destined to rule Europe indefinitely. But victory's foundation was built on frozen lakes filled with corpses, mass graves holding thousands of anonymous dead, and trauma that would echo through generations of survivors. The battle's immediate aftermath demonstrated warfare's industrial nature in the modern era. This wasn't medieval combat where armies fought single-day engagements then dispersed. Napoleonic warfare was systematic application of violence across continental distances, sustained operations that consumed men and material at industrial scales. Austerlitz was factory work applied to killing, efficient, organized, merciless. The future of warfare was visible in those frozen lakes and mass graves. War had become industrial process, and humanity would spend the next 2 centuries perfecting its methods. Napoleon met Tsar Alexander on December 12th at a mill near the village of Austerlitz. The location was deliberately chosen, neutral ground between armies, but close enough to the battlefield that cannon smoke still hung in the air when wind shifted from the west. Alexander arrived with minimal escort, a calculated display of trust that actually revealed desperation. The young Tsar needed peace more than Napoleon did. The contrast between the 2 emperors was striking. Napoleon, at 36, hardened by a decade of continuous campaigning, dressed in his plain grey coat that had become his signature. Alexander, at 28, wearing elaborate Russian imperial uniform, trying to project confidence his military situation didn't support. The meeting lasted 4 hours, but the essential dynamic was established in the first 5 minutes. Napoleon negotiated from strength, while Alexander pleaded from weakness. Alexander proposed a general peace that would restore the pre-war situation with minor adjustments. Napoleon rejected this immediately. France had won total military victory. Returning to status quo ante was absurd. His terms were non-negotiable. Russia would withdraw from all Austrian and German territories, recognise French control of Italy and the Rhineland, cease all military cooperation with Britain, accept French dominance in Central Europe. Alexander had no leverage to refuse. The Treaty of Pressburg with Austria was signed on December 26th. Austria ceded territory containing 3 million inhabitants, paid 40 million francs indemnity, reduced its army to 150,000 troops under French supervision. The Habsburg Empire that had dominated Central Europe for centuries was reduced to second-rate power in 3 weeks. Emperor Francis signed documents that essentially made Austria a French satellite, ending 400 years of Habsburg resistance to any power that threatened their dominance. Prussia watched these developments with mounting alarm. Frederick William III had maintained cautious neutrality during the Austerlitz campaign, refusing to commit troops to either side while calculating which alliance offered better terms. The speed and totality of Napoleon's victory changed everything. Prussia was now surrounded by French-controlled territory, the Rhineland to the west, satellite states to the south, Russian withdrawal removing any buffer to the east. Neutrality was becoming untenable. The geopolitical transformation extended beyond Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened, would be formally dissolved in 1806 at Napoleon's insistence. The 1,000-year-old institution that had organized German-speaking territories under nominal Habsburg control ceased to exist. Napoleon replaced it with the Confederation of the Rhine, German states organized under French protection, providing troops and resources for future French campaigns. Central Europe was being reorganized according to French strategic requirements. Britain remained the sole major power still opposing France after Austerlitz. The Royal Navy controlled the seas but couldn't project power onto the European continent where French armies were supreme. British strategy relied on funding continental coalitions, paying subsidies to nations willing to fight France. Austerlitz had demonstrated the futility of this approach. British gold couldn't overcome French military superiority. The strategic stalemate between French land power and British sea power would define European warfare for the next decade. Russian forces completed their withdrawal from Austria by January 1806. The retreat was orderly, but the human cost was staggering. Thousands of wounded died during the march east through winter conditions. Desertion rates reached 20% in some regiments. Equipment losses exceeded what could be replaced in a single campaign season. The army that retreated to Poland was a broken force requiring complete reconstruction before it could threaten French interests again. Tsar Alexander returned to St. Petersburg in February 1806, facing the worst political crisis of his reign. Russian nobility questioned his military judgment, blamed him personally for the disaster at Austerlitz, demanded explanations for the 27,000 casualties suffered in a single day. Alexander's response was defensive. He blamed his generals, claimed French numerical superiority that didn't exist, suggested treachery by Austrian allies who'd collapsed too quickly. The young Tsar couldn't accept that he'd been outgeneraled by a Corsican upstart. The psychological impact of Austerlitz on Russian military culture was profound and lasting. Before December 2nd, 1805, Russian armies had considered themselves invincible, conquerors of Turks and Swedes, defenders of European civilization against revolutionary chaos. After Austerlitz, Russian officers understood they'd been outmatched in every dimension of warfare. French tactical systems were superior, French operational planning was more sophisticated, French strategic vision was more comprehensive. The realization that Russia was militarily inferior to France would drive Russian military reforms for the next decade. Austrian military culture suffered even worse damage. The Habsburg army had been destroyed 3 times in 10 years, at Marengo in 1800, Ulm in 1805, Austerlitz in 1805. The institutional confidence that armies require to function effectively was shattered. Austrian officers knew their tactical doctrines were obsolete, their strategic thinking was inadequate, their command structure was dysfunctional. The reforms attempted after Austerlitz would take years to implement and would ultimately fail to prevent Austrian defeat in 1809. Napoleon's marshals received rewards proportionate to their contributions. Davout was promoted to Duke of Auerstedt for holding the impossible southern position. Soult became Duke of Dalmatia for taking the Pratzen Heights. Lannes received the title Duke of Montebello. Murat's pursuit operations earned him the Grand Duchy of Berg. The imperial nobility Napoleon was creating wasn't based on inherited bloodlines, but on military achievement. Revolutionary principle applied to aristocratic forms. The soldiers who'd actually fought the battle received less tangible rewards. Survivors were granted extra pay, a bonus equivalent to 2 months' wages. Wounded veterans received pensions if they could navigate the bureaucratic requirements. Families of the dead received nothing unless the soldier had been an officer. The revolutionary promise of equality didn't extend to compensation for military service. Officers' widows received pensions. Enlisted men's widows received sympathy at best. French propaganda transformed Austerlitz into mythological victory almost immediately. Official accounts minimized French casualties while exaggerating Allied losses. Napoleon's tactical genius was praised in terms approaching worship. The battle became proof that French revolutionary armies were invincible, that enemies of France would inevitably be destroyed, that Napoleon himself was touched by destiny. The propaganda served practical purposes, intimidating potential enemies, maintaining domestic support for endless wars, justifying the transformation of republic into empire. The reality visible to anyone who visited the battlefield was less glorious. Mass graves that would sink and collapse for years as bodies decomposed. The Sachan ponds where ice would remain stained for months from blood that had seeped into frozen water. Villages depopulated by armies that had seized all food and conscripted all young men. Austrian civilians who'd lost homes, livestock, family members to a war that had nothing to do with their interests or desires. Military theorists began analysing Austerlitz within weeks of the battle. The deception that drew Allied forces off the Pratzen Heights became a standard lesson in military academies. The coordinated assault from multiple directions became a model for combined arms operations. The pursuit phase that prevented enemy rally became doctrine for exploiting breakthrough. Future generals would study Austerlitz the way previous generations had studied Alexander's campaigns, seeking to replicate Napoleon's methods in their own wars. But the lessons generals drew from Austerlitz often ignored its context. Napoleon had faced enemies using obsolete tactics, led by commanders who misunderstood modern warfare, hampered by alliance politics that prevented unified action. His victory was brilliant, but also benefited from Allied incompetence. Future commanders would try to replicate Austerlitz's tactical perfection against enemies who'd studied the same battle and adapted their methods to prevent similar defeats. The strategies that worked in 1805 would fail catastrophically in later campaigns. The human cost became clearer as spring 1806 brought thaw to the battlefield. Bodies that had been frozen in December began decomposing when temperatures rose. Austrian farmers returning to abandoned villages found corpses in their fields, their homes, their churches. The cleanup took months. Bodies had to be reburied in proper graves. Equipment had to be cleared from roads and streams. Unexploded ordnance had to be collected before it killed civilians. The physical scars of battle would fade over years, but the landscape remained marked. Survivors struggled with trauma that 19th century society didn't acknowledge or understand. French veterans who'd fought at Austerlitz experienced recurring nightmares, sudden panic attacks triggered by loud noises, depression that made civilian life impossible. Military culture offered no support. Soldiers who couldn't function were dismissed as cowards or malingerers. Many became alcoholics, using drink to suppress memories of frozen lakes and screaming wounded and the smell of gunpowder mixed with blood. Russian survivors faced additional burden of explaining defeat to a society that had expected easy victory. Officers who'd retreated from the Pratzen Heights were questioned about their courage, their loyalty, their competence. Enlisted men who'd survived when so many died faced suspicion. Perhaps they'd run rather than fought. Perhaps they'd surrendered rather than resisting. The psychological warfare Napoleon had waged through terror tactics like the Satshan bombardment achieved its goal. Russian military culture was poisoned by doubt and recrimination. Austrian society essentially gave up after Austerlitz. The treaty terms were so punishing that national recovery seemed impossible. Austria had lost territory, population, resources, and most critically, the belief that it could defend itself against French aggression. The Habsburg Empire would continue existing, but as declining power managing its own disintegration, rather than as active player in European politics. The confidence that empires require to function had been destroyed along with the army at Austerlitz. Napoleon's empire reached its maximum extent in the 2 years following Austerlitz. French-controlled territory stretched from the Atlantic to Poland, from the North Sea to southern Italy. The continental system attempted to exclude British trade from all of Europe. French law was imposed on dozens of nations. French officials administered territories containing 80 million people. The empire Napoleon built on Austerlitz's foundation appeared permanent and unshakable. But the empire's foundation was military force maintained through continuous warfare. Every conquered territory required garrison troops. Every satellite state could revolt if French control weakened. Every defeated enemy waited for opportunity to resume fighting. Napoleon needed constant victories to maintain the system. Any significant defeat would encourage rebellion and coalition warfare. The pressure to keep winning would eventually drive him to catastrophic strategic mistakes. The Spanish campaign of 1808 would demonstrate the empire's fragility. An army of 300,000 French troops couldn't control a hostile population using guerrilla tactics. The resources devoted to Spain would be unavailable for other campaigns. The psychological impact of failing to quickly defeat Spanish resistance would encourage other nations to challenge French dominance. Austerlitz had created an empire too large to defend with available forces. The Russian campaign of 1812 would prove fatal. Napoleon invaded Russia with 600,000 troops, the largest army ever assembled in European history. Russian forces retreated using scorched-earth tactics that destroyed French supply systems. The Grand Army captured Moscow but couldn't force Russian capitulation. Winter and starvation destroyed Napoleon's army during the retreat from Moscow. Only 100,000 troops survived to reach friendly territory. The catastrophe was Austerlitz in reverse. Tactical brilliance overcome by strategic overextension. The empire that seemed invincible in December 1805 would collapse by April 1814. Coalition forces would enter Paris and force Napoleon's abdication. The territorial gains from Austerlitz would be reversed by the Congress of Vienna. The continental system would be dismantled. French dominance of Europe would end, replaced by balance of power politics designed specifically to prevent any single nation from achieving hegemony again. The victory that had seemed permanent lasted less than a decade, but Austerlitz's military significance transcended Napoleon's empire. The battle demonstrated that modern warfare favoured commanders who understood logistics, deception, combined arms coordination, and operational tempo. Future military organisations would emphasise general staff systems, professional officer education, systematic intelligence gathering, all lessons derived from studying how Napoleon had outmanoeuvred the Third Coalition. Modern military science essentially began at Austerlitz. The human dimension was ignored by military theorists, but remained central to the battle's meaning. 50,000 casualties in a single day represented industrial-scale violence that would only accelerate through the 19th and 20th centuries. Austerlitz proved that modern nations could mobilize, equip, and deploy armies of unprecedented size, then accept catastrophic losses without national collapse. The battle was preview of World War I's industrialized slaughter. Different technology, but same underlying logic of mass mobilization and mass casualties. December 2nd, 1805 marked the moment when warfare fully transitioned from limited conflicts between professional armies to total wars between industrialized nations. The French Revolution had created citizen soldier armies fighting for ideological goals rather than dynastic interests. Austerlitz demonstrated what those armies could achieve: total victory over traditional forces, rapid operational tempo that traditional strategies couldn't counter, willingness to accept casualties that would have stopped wars in previous eras. Modern total war emerged from the frozen fields of Moravia. Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile on St. Helena in 1821, 16 years after his greatest victory. He spent his final years dictating memoirs that emphasized Austerlitz as proof of his genius. The battle had been perfect: the deception, the timing, the execution. Every element had functioned as planned. The victory validated everything Napoleon believed about warfare, strategy, and his own destiny. But the empire built on that victory had collapsed, leaving only memories and analysis for future generations. The soldiers who fought at Austerlitz and survived into old age carried different memories. They remembered the cold, the hunger, the terror of artillery bombardment. They remembered friends dying in front of them, the smell of powder smoke and blood, the screaming of wounded men abandoned overnight. They remembered frozen lakes filled with drowning Russians, mass graves being dug by Austrian civilians, victory celebrations that felt hollow because so many hadn't survived to celebrate. Their Austerlitz was horror punctuated by moments of desperate courage, not the mythological perfect battle that military academies taught. The battlefield itself became pilgrimage site for military history enthusiasts. Monuments were erected marking key positions: the Pratzen Heights, where Soult's assault decided the battle; the villages where Davout's corps held impossible positions; observation points where Napoleon had commanded the Grand Army. Tour guides showed visitors where thousands had died, explained the tactical movements, quoted Napoleon's dispatches. The blood and suffering and trauma were sanitized into academic exercises in military science. Modern historians analyzing Austerlitz recognize it as a masterpiece of Napoleonic warfare, perhaps the most perfectly executed battle in military history. The deception, coordination, and timing required to accomplish what Napoleon achieved against superior numbers represented the absolute peak of early 19th century military art. No subsequent battle would demonstrate such complete integration of intelligence, logistics, tactics, and operational planning. Austerlitz remained the standard against which military genius was measured, but the battle's perfection was also its danger. Austerlitz convinced Napoleon and his marshals that French military methods were invincible, that superior tactics could overcome any strategic disadvantage, that audacity and speed would always triumph over cautious conventional warfare. This overconfidence led directly to the disasters in Spain and Russia, campaigns where tactical brilliance proved insufficient against determined resistance and hostile logistics. Austerlitz's perfection blinded French military leadership to warfare's changing nature. The true legacy of Austerlitz was ambiguous: military achievement of unprecedented scale and sophistication, strategic victory that reshaped European power structures, tactical lessons that would influence warfare for generations. but also a demonstration that modern industrial nations could mobilize resources for conflicts of previously unimaginable destructiveness. The battle previewed World War I's industrial slaughter, not in technology, but in the underlying logic of total war between mass-mobilized societies, accepting catastrophic casualties to achieve political objectives. 50,000 casualties in a single day, mass graves holding thousands of anonymous soldiers, frozen lakes that became drowning pools, villages destroyed and depopulated, civilians caught between armies caring nothing for their survival. This was Austerlitz's reality beneath the military analysis and strategic significance. Modern warfare had arrived, and humanity would spend the next 2 centuries refining its methods, while the casualty counts grew from thousands to millions to tens of millions. The sun set over the Pratzen Heights on December 2nd, 1805, illuminating a battlefield where Napoleon Bonaparte had demonstrated military genius at its absolute peak. But that same sun also illuminated the cost: frozen corpses scattered across miles of Moravian terrain, the beginning of modern warfare's industrial approach to killing, and the realization that human civilization had developed the capacity to destroy itself through organized violence on scales previously impossible. Austerlitz was both culmination of classical warfare and birth of the industrial slaughter that would define the modern era. The battle's perfection was also its warning, ignored by generations of commanders who saw only the tactical brilliance while missing the deeper horror of what modern war had become.